Hello and welcome to everyone who is starting to join us. My name is Will Torres. I'm one of the admission officers at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. So excited for you to join us. We have two amazing guests. I like to think of them as icons on campus, especially when it comes to the work behind what's been happening with diversity, equity, and inclusion here at the GSB. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. What's going to happen is I have a couple of questions for them. From there, we're just gonna have some discussion and open it up to a Q&A box. So as you start to come up with questions or things that you wanna inquire, go ahead and pop that in there. We're happy to help evolve the conversation. So with that, Sarah, could you please introduce yourself, maybe your name, your role, and what inspires you to this work?
Terrific. Thank you, Will, and welcome everybody. I'm so excited to be part of this panel with my colleagues, Will and Lori, and I'm excited to meet some of you virtually and to see where you're all coming in from. So I am a professor here at the Graduate School of Business in the Organizational Behavior group, but I'm also serving as the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. So I'm one of the Dean's leadership team. And in that role, I oversee our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts with my collaborators, such as Will and Lori, and some of the other folks that you've had a chance to meet this week. And when I think about what inspires me about this work, I think I can sum it up pretty easily by saying that at the GSB, what we want to do is to train principled and purposeful leaders who are going to make meaningful, and I'm going to add positive, change in the world. And as we work on these efforts at the school, what we hope is that we are going to be able to inspire our students, inspire our staff, inspire our faculty, our alums to join us in these efforts. And by doing this together, we can make positive change in the world. And to me, that's inspiring. Lori?
Thank you so much, Sarah. My name is Lori Mackenzie, and I am the lead strategist for diversity, equity, and inclusion here at Stanford GSB. And I come from a corporate background. So prior to coming here, I worked at companies like Procter & Gamble and Apple and eBay. And in part, that's what inspires me for this work. The most amazing leaders I've seen who have been very agile, who can think deeply about what both customers want and what their internal employees want. Those great leaders have cared deeply about the diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations. So what inspires me is that this work that we do is contributing to better leadership, better run organizations, and to your point, Sarah, hopefully positive change that benefits everybody.
Lori, you also wear a different hat on campus. Can you just tell us a little bit about that too, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Will, for saying that. I also co-founded the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab, which makes my title, I think, the longest title. It never fits on a line anywhere. And what we do is we do the research in organizations for inclusion, and we have an affiliates program where 60 companies like big ones like Google, Facebook, Schwab join in order to benefit from our research, but to also inform our research. And again, I get to work with Sarah because Sarah is one of the faculty sponsors of that organization. So our worlds across campus truly are intertwined.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that folks knew so much is happening in the space. And even as we think about where we are today, a lot of the work that we've been doing at the GSB kind of takes us back a few years. Last year, 2019, we published the first DEI report. But even in the steps to get there, there was progress that was happening. So maybe Sarah and Lori, as kind of some of our leaders on this front, what brought us to the DEI report? What inspired it? Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Can start, and then Lori, you can jump in and piggyback on some of the things that I have to say. And I think that it's important to sort of recognize something that is actually important to understand about the school. And that is, until Dean John Levin had taken over as the dean of the school, there hadn't been a dean who had decided that he or she needed to have and actually in this case, it's all he, but that he needed to have one of his leadership team members overseeing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that itself was a big step. And I have to say, in some ways, shocking that the business school hadn't done that before. Now, that wasn't to say that the deans weren't interested in this, because they were, but they hadn't. They had sort of taken a different approach, which was a lot less, I guess, a lot less centralized, although it's still pretty decentralized here, which is part of the way we have set this up. But that itself was really important. And as I took over the reins and took over that role, one of the things that I wanted to do was to spend a lot of time really taking a design thinking like approach to this. One of the areas that I do teach when I am teaching is design thinking, particularly thinking about design thinking as it might apply within organizations to improve organizations, and often around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So I began that process by spending about 18 months talking and listening, and I want to emphasize mostly listening and answering questions, and talking to staff members at the GSB, staff members across campus, faculty all over campus, alums, students, of course, all of our student bodies, in the MBA students, the MSX students, executive education participants, PhD students, and trying to understand exactly what was being done where. I was really lucky because there are a lot of passionate people at the GSB who work and were working on diversity topics, equity topics, inclusion topics. And there was a wonderful sort of informal working group that was working together on these topics. And so I was able to get a lot of information fairly quickly. And that led up to the beginning of the report. And at about that time, and I'll kind of hand the baton over to Lori, that's when I decided that we really needed at the GSB a lead strategist to help us think about how to structure that report. Somebody who had spent a lot of time, like Lori, doing work in companies, doing work at the university, and understanding all of the different landscapes, and thinking about what we might want to put in the report. And also, importantly, how we might want to think strategically about what we wanted to do going forward. Because with the report, and I hope you'll get a chance to read it, and Lori and I and our team are finishing up the 2020 version right now. It's being designed and formatted, so that's exciting. And a shout out to a lot of folks like Will who've given us feedback along the way. But one of the things that we do in the report is talk about what we've done, but spend a lot of time talking about what we need to do and what we want to do going forward. And so I knew that I needed some help with that. And at that time, I brought Lori on first in a consulting role, and then eventually we were able to convince her to come on in the lead strategist role. So Lori, I'll hand it over to you and see if you wanted to add anything to the lead up to the DEI report, the first one.
I love what you said, Sarah, because there was already so much good work happening. And I think one of the outcomes of the report is those sparks of great DEI work moved from being a spark into a lasting program that we're now able to evaluate how we're doing year over year. And one of my favorite examples is the case study project. So one of the priorities of our work here at Stanford GSB is creating an inclusive classroom and learning experience. We feel like that's critical to our mission of developing purposeful and principled leaders. So the first step was looking at all the case studies that are taught in the core and finding if there was anything we could learn about what was being taught. And we discovered that in some, written by us or written by other business schools, there are stereotypical trends that may make us not see the fullness of the protagonists in the case studies. So we wrote this up in a Harvard Business Review piece. And what I love about the report is it enabled us to not have that be a one and done. We wrote it up, it's done. It helped us build momentum. So here's some of the momentum we built out of that. One, we started to have dialogues with faculty about these stereotypical trends, and Sarah and her colleagues developed a whole training session on managing and teaching these kinds of topics in the classroom. The second outcome was that we trained all of the case writers on this trend, and we have a commitment that there are no stereotypical trends in our case studies. And just this week, I got to review one that's being published now and to work with the team to take some of those languages out. And the last thing, it kind of underpinned the training that we do. If this is how we inadvertently think of people in stereotypical ways, how can everyone, our staff and our students, benefit from these insights? So I think we've moved, the report has helped us move from thinking very specifically about a project and turning it into maybe an internal movement that we have that will touch more and more people. And whenever we can, we publish these pieces in public magazines or outlets like Harvard Business Review and Fast Company, because one of our commitments in the report is that we share these good ideas out with the world. One of my favorite ideas is if we're lucky enough and you do come to Stanford, is one of the first things you'll experience is something called fitting in and standing out. It's like, how can you both become part of our culture, but not subsumed by it? How can you also contribute your unique person? So fitting in and standing out. And it was such a beautiful concept. Well, Sarah and I decided to write up this concept in a Fast Company piece to share it more broadly with the world. So part of what our DEI report enables us to do is to build momentum around our ideas and then to share them through the world with free resources or publications that we do. So I'll stop there so we can get on to your other questions, Will.
Yeah, Will, before you do that, I wanted to just say one more thing about the CASE project and some of this work that we've been doing here. And I think this is really important, and it's partially because so many of us have connections to faculty and staff at our peer institutions, but not only are we trying to share the work out there broadly, we're also specifically collaborating and working with our colleagues at our peer institutions to do similar sorts of analyses of their case studies and their class materials. And so it's really, that's another thing that's been very inspiring about this work. And that is the phone calls and the Zooms and the emails from our friends at other business schools who are saying, hey, how did you start this project? And can you give us the templates you use for identifying stereotypical language, what's coming up next, and so on. And so, to sort of double click on something Lori said about starting a little social movement, not just internally, but starting it externally too, has been part of what's been gratifying and I think important for business education writ large.
The two of you brought up the notion of momentum. And so how do you go from a moment or a project and build some of that, knowing that for some companies or organizations, there's a lot of inertia to stay still? And this kind of is also inspired by one of the questions in the Q&A box from Charlie about, roadblocks in the process. There's a lot of DI efforts in place, but there are resource constraints and or privacy concerns. Like, how do you build momentum to be able to kind of tackle some of those?
Yeah, I'll start. And then Lori, I'd love to hear your response too. And Charlie, thanks for the question. I think that's a really great question because we'd be lying if we said there weren't some roadblocks along the way. And, Will, you identified several of these, privacy concerns, resource constraints. I'll also say, and this is always the case with DEI work in whether you're in nonprofits, for-profits, education, public sector, is there are going to be some people who are committed and passionate. There is going to be another set of people who could be moved, but a little bit more agnostic. And then there are going to be some resistors. And so part of what we need to do as we do this work, and part of what we focused on doing, is trying to move those who are agnostic into the passionate camp and trying to figure out ways to reach in some way some of the resistors. And we're not going to get them all, we aren't, but importantly, we do this by framing what the issues are and why they're important, and by telling stories of the successes that we have. And that the sort of proof of concept of some of the work that we're doing has been part of how I think we've approached this work. Other constraints, resource constraints, there are always going to be resource constraints, but I also like to think about constraints. Any constraint you have is a source of opportunity and innovation. And so when you think about what you're running into a roadblock, one of the things that I often say is, well, it's time to just redefine the problem a little bit. If we are not going to be able to get over this roadblock, we need to redefine what the problem is and pivot and think of a different way to approach it. And that usually works, because usually we can find some silver lining in all of the little bumps that we have along the way, and learn something from them too. Lori, did you want to chime in?
Sure, I love so much of what you said, and I just want to add to it. So often with the idea of how do you make an organization more inclusive, it feels like you're boiling the ocean, and it might be similar to thinking, how do we become more innovative? And if you stay in that big question only, it can almost be paralyzing to think, how can I get going? And you said something, Sarah, about a proof point. And sometimes in our work, we call it a pilot, that instead of boiling the ocean, find where you can create change, work there to find out what works in your organization, and then grow from that momentum, as opposed to really thinking, how can I boil the ocean? And then you said a really brilliant thing about constraints. It turns out if you try to centralize a diversity and inclusion budget in an organization, that budget can often be seen as something that can be cut. But if instead you run the pilots in different organizations and have those organizations own the building of the momentum of those pilots, you've then dispersed the expertise, the budget, and the momentum throughout the organization instead of centralizing it. So we see ourselves often as catalysts to enable our well-intentioned and passionate colleagues to build the pilots to have successes that we can then spread throughout the organization, versus feeling like, oh, we should boil the ocean. And I think that's what's exciting. This year, when we wrote the report, we had 74 entries of positive change our colleagues have promoted throughout the business school. So that kind of positive change is very hard to do if Sarah and I have to poke and initiate everything centrally. So I'm optimistic. I know there's a lot of work to do, but that momentum is definitely happening where we are.
Yeah, that really brings to mind like the concept of small wins that you wrote about in the first DEI report, and how that can be a catalyst for change.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, Will. The small wins, and telling the stories about the small wins, and showing people that this can work, and inspiring people, because, as Charlie said, there are going to be roadblocks along the way and things that we're going to have to, come up against. But, the really good news is, and we have sort of it's almost a subtitle of the DEI report this year, which is about building momentum, and how this work has begun to spread, and people in the organization are beginning to redefine how they approach their work with a different lens. And I think that's part of what we hope for in an organizational change of any kind, because it really is about cultural change in the organization.
That could be the subtext or the subtitle for next year's DEI report: adding lenses.
Yes.
Lori, something that I'm actually really curious about, like as you were coming up and getting immersed in the GSB culture, like higher education, an institution like the GSB, it's its own thing. Having a perspective from kind of the corporate private side, what are some things anything that stood out to you, things that you noticed, kind of shifts in the way that you might have had to approach questions that you were asking yourself?
That's such a great question, Will, because culture really does matter. Context really does matter. And if I came to GSB and said, I want to create change exactly as I know I've helped create it in a startup or in a tech company, and I probably would have incited more resistance than brought more people on board. So that's really great. And think about a lot about mission and values, because when there's a mission-driven organization that's pretty clear about what they value, that's a great way to get to find how we can move together. So when I came here, what I was really struck with is that the mission already has a commitment to purposeful and principled leaders. And in my view, I can't think of anything more purposeful than creating organizations where everyone can be seen and thrive to produce better outcomes for the organization. So starting there and having conversations with colleagues about how they contribute to it. Exec Ed does it in one way by empowering leaders to advance themselves. Our MBA classrooms do it by empowering a diversity of leaders with the skills, networks, and connections to be very successful when they leave. Meeting people in, for example, facilities. Our facilities want to create environments in which people could have meaningful engagements and thrive. So wherever I kind of reached out to people, having that common goal helped us find directions we wanted to move in together. And the last thing I'd say is, most of the work of diversity and inclusion doesn't happen in big moments. It happens inside of relationships. And being able to carefully see people for who they are, to value them, to learn from them, that's something that works in every organization. So I think it's caring deeply about relationships and finding common goals and directions we're moving towards was how I entered my work here at GSB. And I have the most amazing network now of colleagues like you, Will, and of course, Sarah, that I feel so at home with. I feel like we can do almost anything together. And so anyhow, it's been a good couple years.
And then, so I really like what you said about like change happens in like some of those small moments. Context really matters. And this kind of ties back to some of what you were saying, even to the response before that, where when there's roadblocks, kind of the evolution and kind of focusing on the small areas as a way to build that momentum. So it feels like there's a lot there.
Totally. I mean, I wanted to say, yeah, I was thinking of the same thing, Will. One of the things that Lori said that I think is really important, and I want to give you some examples to make it more concrete. So Lori was talking about relationships and getting to know and understand people all over campus and so on. And she mentioned, like, for example, facilities, that they want to make this a beautiful and welcoming place for all of us. One of the projects that Lori and I worked on in the first or second year of our work was thinking a little bit about things like the art that is hanging around the campus. And in particular, we targeted and thought about the faculty building, which is, of course, where the faculty offices are, but where you as students would come and meet with faculty for office hours or walk through to grab a cup of coffee, these kinds of things. And the art was not representative at all of what we aspire to be, but it was really geared towards thinking about the history of the school. And there's nothing wrong with thinking about the history. We need to honor the history of the school. But what we wanted to do, and what Dean Levin wanted to do, was to provide a more aspirational view of the school and to show the school as it is now, as students are learning now, as faculty are teaching now, as staff and faculty are collaborating, as students are talking to alums and all of that. And so we were really lucky to have some talented photographers as part of our marketing and communications group who took unbelievably beautiful pictures all over campus. And we've now been changing out all of the art in the faculty building. And that sounds like in a sense, it almost seems like, well, that's a no-brainer. And it kind of is a no-brainer, but there's actually research behind this, which is known as ambient belonging research, which shows that when people see the physical space around them and feel like they're represented in the space, and that they feel like it represents how the space is now, they feel more comfortable. And so that's just one small example of thinking about how our colleagues and facilities engaged with this work. Another quick one I'll give you just off the cuff is, when we started doing this work and started talking about inclusion, our IT group had been talking and thinking about how to make our website and our documents more inclusive. And now they've got a big project on digital accessibility and making sure that the content that we put out is accessible to everyone, we're not putting up any kinds of hurdles so that people can't access our content. So by bringing this DEI lens to all of the work we do, and by connecting to colleagues and bringing people into this project with us and finding small wins and redefining the work, that's how we make cultural change.
Yeah, change is a common theme here, and it's almost, sometimes it feels like there might be a tension between honoring tradition and history versus kind of understanding, recognizing, and embracing the evolution of organizations. So it's almost like, how do you navigate that? Any tips on how do you navigate that? And how do you have conversations with folks who might lean more towards, this was our history, so that should be, how we need to be? Like, any tips on approaching that dialogue?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Will. It's such a good question. And by the way, this is beyond even diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's in all of our work. We'll be doing this. And I think that one of the things that I think is really important in all of this work is asking people to take the perspective of others and to step into the shoes of others. And when you say to somebody who may be, a proponent of keeping all of the old history art up, and by the way, we found homes for the old artwork and so on too. It wasn't like we, were rewriting history. We just found different places for them. But when you say to people, well, do you understand? And I said this to some of them. I said, do you understand, as one of the, the few senior women faculty, I would like to see more women represented in these photos, because it makes me feel excluded. As soon as you ask them to take your perspective, they kind of begin to get it and say, oh, okay. And if you say to them, hey, have you ever felt excluded or like you didn't belong somewhere? It turns out there's a lot of psychological research on belonging and how it is hardwired into us as human beings. And when you sort of point that out and say, do you remember when you didn't feel like you belonged? Well, that's kind of how I feel when there are pictures of, the founding fathers, and they were all fathers of this school. And then they kind of say, oh, I value you as a colleague, and I don't want you to feel hurt. And then they begin to see how we can change things. So that's usually asking people to take perspective, I think, and particularly in an academic environment, pointing to the research on some of this. I noticed in chat that Joanna had put in a link to Spark tools. Some of, I was talking about ambient belonging, and some of the other research on just generally thinking about belonging is available there for free if people are interested in engaging with those. So thanks, Joanna, for putting that in the chat.
If I can, I just want to add one thing that dovetails in what you said, Sarah, is there's really interesting to think about the question of authenticity. And I think this gets at what you were saying, Will. Is it authentic of us to be here and move towards there? Or are you forcing me in a direction? And the interesting thing about authenticity is it actually expands over time. So for example, before business school, it wasn't very authentic of me, or I didn't even know what net present value meant, right? Or I didn't know what it meant to ask about certain things in organizations. And over time, it's become very comfortable and natural for me to think and ask those questions. So authenticity actually expands over time, and who we know ourselves to be will expand over time, both as an individual and an organization. So how do we make room for that expansion instead of viewing it as, detracting from or forcing us in a direction? So I often talk about expansion, which is very natural. So what feels natural today did not feel natural 10 years ago. And I'm excited to think about what's going to feel natural 10 years from now. So sometimes I have this authenticity conversation with people because it's not a fixed way of being, it's a growth way of being. And how can we all grow into a newer and more expansive version of ourselves versus saying it's diminishing who we are and where we came from.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about the different ways to approach this besides kind of a monetary justification. We have a question, a comment from Jimmy, who is talking about sometimes, that's the way to get people's attention, but there are other types of value that can be derived out of this. So like that concept of expansion and growth as individuals and teams is actually like a really interesting concept and juxtaposition with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that observation. I like that observation a lot, because I think that that's exactly right. We need to think about what this does for us as individuals and for organizations, and how we just, without thinking about just the monetary value, how we can think about the value we add. Lori, I cut you off. I'm so sorry.
No, we have kind of a mind melt. So it was funny when Sarah and I were working on a document, we happened to be in there at the same time, even though we could have been there any hour of the day. So Sarah and I often end up having similar thoughts. So I actually enjoy when we do that. And one thing I just wanted to add, I love this point. There's different ways into valuing diversity and inclusion. And one way that is very common in Silicon Valley is to value innovation. And people often can get that part of the value of innovation is bringing together different experiences, knowledges, and heuristics, or ways we learn, to create novel connections between all of our ideas to spark an innovation. So to your point, sometimes people see the monetary value, like we're not going to be able to hire the best if we're not including everyone. We're not going to have the best returns. Others will value innovation, that we want to bring these diverse perspectives together. And some will think about kind of go-to-market reasons, like how can we know our consumers of the future if we ourselves don't have representation on our teams of different kinds of people? So I often say I'm agnostic or open to how you enter the DEI space. I'm really committed that we keep you here and you see that this will fuel what you're up to.
Oh, I love that. Like agnostic for how someone enters into this space. And then, oh, I'm really excited. Sorry, I don't know if you could tell, but like, so a lot of the insights you're providing, I think, are so real to the here and now of the moment of kind of 2020, kind of the rise and renewed awareness of social justice issues in many different ways, and how that's almost forced, in some sense, an evolution in the way we think about this work, DEI. What does that mean for our students and community? Can you talk a little bit about, from your vantage point as kind of overseeing this effort at the GSB, how 2020 has impacted that?
Sure, I'll begin, and then I'll invite Lori to jump in if she wants. So yes, 2020. Well, I don't need to even, I can say unprecedented. I can say it was kind of a dumpster fire. I can say all kinds of things about 2020. But what's happened here, going back to something we said earlier about constraints and roadblocks being opportunities and so on, I think that Lori and I, and certainly Will, and many of our colleagues who work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, try to take a positive and optimistic view on our work, because I think it's necessary. But 2020, as we all know, has been a very, very tough year for all of the reasons that we know. But certainly, I'll focus on, I'm not going to talk about the pandemic, and I'm not going to talk about economic uncertainty. I'm not going to talk about online learning. I'm not going to talk about all that. But let's just talk about the brutal murder of George Floyd and the ensuing wave of protest that happened in this country. And what that protest did, which I think is, that wave of protest did, which I think is important to what we do here, but other organizations, was it allowed a new conversation to come into organizations and to add as an important corrective to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And what that did, and what that meant to us here at the GSB, was that we recognized that our efforts to date had not done as much as they should with respect to race and thinking about systemic racism and thinking about racial injustice, both in terms of how we want to view our own community, but also how we want to train our students as they go out to lead organizations. And so what this led us to do, and this took place, mostly in June and July of this year, was to spend a lot of time. I said at the beginning that when we started the first diversity, equity, and inclusion report, I spent a lot of time and then brought others into the fold of listening and learning and listening and learning. And we accelerated that again and had another wave of discussions and conversations with our Black alums, our Black students, allies of our Black alums and Black students, Black staff and allies, and faculty and allies. And we spent a lot of time learning and understanding and listening to their stories and listening to what they were asking for the Black community from the GSB. And that led us to, in July 2020, we published our action plan for racial equity, which we can give you the link for that on the website. And then as follow-up, I hope that we'll be able to send you in about 3 weeks the new DEI report, which has our first update on how we've been doing on the action plan for racial equity. But very briefly, what we promised to do in the action plan for racial equity was to think about 4 kind of categories of work that we were committing to. And the first is increasing representation. And so, part of what we have been doing and engaging in for many years is trying to get the most representative and diverse class that we can. And Will and his colleagues have been doing an amazing job at that. But we wanted to think about other things that we could be doing to increase representation, not just in MBA, but also in the PhD program, MSX program, and also in our executive education programs. And so that's one piece of what we've been doing. And also on the faculty side and the staff side, and taking to task how we might be able to increase diversity of our community. So one of the things that is going on at the GSB right now is that, not the GSB, I'm sorry, at Stanford, but we are actively part of this, is that the provost of Stanford created 10 new faculty lines for people who study race in America. And so we are, right now at the GSB, all of the areas are looking and searching in this area so that we can bring more scholars to campus who focus specifically on race in America. In our case, in the GSB, it will be race and business primarily. So that's one thing. The second bucket is working more. We've already talked a little bit about belonging and a culture of belonging and inclusion and belonging. And so we've been working on that as well. That's the second bucket. And so we've been coming up with a number of different ways in which we can do this, from thinking about class materials. We've talked about case studies, but we have an initiative that to write case studies this year on underrepresented minorities, especially Black leaders. And the last time I checked with the case writing operation, there were 6 new cases on Black leaders that are underway. So that's one example of thinking about how to build a culture of inclusion in the classroom. And then making positive change beyond the GSB is the third kind of category that we've promised in the action plan for racial equity. And we've done a number of different things in this area. For example, Senior Associate Dean and Professor Brian Lowery ran a class called Leadership for Society, Race and Power, and has turned that into a podcast. So we can give you a link to hear some of those discussions. And it was sort of a speaker series on race and power in America. I created with a colleague, Maggie Neal, and another colleague, Hannah Yanow, an anti-racism and allyship 7-day journey. It's kind of a 7 days of study and reflection and commitment to action around anti-racism and allyship. A lot of other things that we've been doing, and you can read about this in the upcoming DEI report. And then finally, and really importantly, and I saw a question in the question and answers about this too, that I wanted to touch on, is how we're going to hold ourselves accountable to the action plan for racial equity. And we are in the process right now of building a DEI council, and Lori and I will be meeting soon to complete, with another one of our colleagues, to complete our review of MBA students who have applied for the slots on the DEI Council, also PhD students, and then we'll also have staff and faculty as well on that. And then we've also committed to certain roles at the GSB, which we will be actively trying to fill. There's one, for example, that is, I can't announce it quite yet, but we're very close to filling, which is a director of diverse alumni communities, which will be in the Alumni Relations Organization. So there's a lot going on in the action plan for racial equity, but I would say, Will, to your original question, how did 2020 change what we are doing? We doubled down on our efforts, specifically on thinking about race, racial justice, systemic racism, and eliminating systemic racism to the extent that we can, and the power that we have as an institution and as individuals.
You mentioned allyship and many of the different actions we're taking in the many different spaces that make up the GSB. I mean, oftentimes we just think about the student body as kind of the school, whereas it's this whole like universe of things and people that make it run and make it the special place it is. This is one of our earlier questions here. Like, what are some different ways that you've seen students get involved in this effort? How can people get involved once they're here? You just mentioned the DEI Council, but that's just one of multiple spaces that kind of we've seen students.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take a stab, and then I hope you two will add on, because the short answer is, and I flag that as one of the things, the DEI Council, but the Diversity Committee is another area in which a lot of our passionate students have come to be. I don't want to say work, but there's obviously a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion amongst the student bodies. And so that's one area. And then we also have a number of identity groups on campus, and a number of our students who are interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion are also part of and active in the identity group space. And then I'll also say that, and this has been really gratifying for me, and I know Lori too, when we write the diversity, equity, and inclusion report, we ask for feedback, and we ask for feedback in the way of, hey, can you suggest some things that are going on amongst the student groups, the student bodies that you would like us to include? But then also, would you help us to, read this and take a look at the language? Are we getting this right, or are we somehow inadvertently not being inclusive in our language? And so that's another way that students have been involved in the work that we are doing. Lori and Will, others, there's a lot more, I'm sure.
Well, one of my favorites is the classes that students can take once they're at GSB. And some of them I've been fortunate enough to be a guest in, so I've gotten to take a peek inside of. One of those that I love is called Equity by Design, which takes place in a lab. So it's looking at all the questions you're asking and getting the research, getting the insights, and then creating your own pathways to see what you might do to design when you're a leader in an organization. So there's a number of classes you can take. There's also, interestingly, because many groups are looking at how they can bring this diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to the work they're doing. For example, our Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, they are looking at how they can bring DEI as a criteria for thinking about investing in organizations. What would that look like? So students who are interested in entrepreneurship can also look at how to bring a DEI lens into how they evaluate organizations. I love the Center for Social Innovation as well, thinking about how I think 94% of our students participated in some way with CESI, our Center for Social Innovation. So how can you contribute to your own leadership development by working with or taking a class with one of our centers that has as part of its lens diversity, equity, inclusion, and so bring that lens to the work you're doing. And Will, I know you're also fostering a lot of work around that as well.
Yeah, one of the conversations that the students are having that I find so invigorating and inspiring is the increased sensitivity and awareness about intersectionality. What does that mean for kind of the way we move through space? What does that mean for the way that the world influences and impacts our own experience. And then kind of hand in hand with that is allyship, and how do we kind of be there with um, and for those, you know, in our community. And that comes to one of the questions, actually using that as a segue to one of the questions to maybe get your thoughts on. Um, how can students balance the interest to engage, or any individual for that matter, as an ally with groups that are outside of their identity without, quote, intruding or taking away from the experience of those who do identify with that particular group? And this is a question from Missy out there. Any tips there?
Thanks, Missy. I'll take one stab, and then Lori, it looked like Lori was about to. Lori, do you want to go first this time? Okay, I'll take one stab. I think this is such an important and deep question, Missy, because this is such a, there's such a tricky and delicate balance. But you know what, and I'll sort of share from my own experience. When part of the reason that we created the anti-racism and allyship journey was that we were inspired and also humbled by the fact that during that period, the beginning, you know, that I've already made reference to, after the killing of George Floyd and during the Black Lives Matter protests, all of our Black colleagues were being asked to contribute to a panel, or come and talk to this group, or create this, or come educate us on something. And we were humbled and inspired by what they were doing, but also understanding that this was an identity tax on them. And so what we wanted to do was to try to create something as academics, and it's an academic, you know, the research behind the anti-racism and allyship journey comes from academics. We wanted to do that as a way to try not to intrude on the space, do it with their blessing, but understanding that we were doing this as allies. And we have gotten, you know, incredibly positive feedback about that, because it was both an act of allyship. And so my point really here, and this is speaking from experience, less from, you know, giving the playbook for how to do this, was that humility is part of what is key, I think, in when we are trying to act as allies, and being sure that when we act as an ally, we're not there to teach, we're not there to intrude, we're there to listen, and we're there to help. And importantly, we're there to do something, right? There's, you know, one of the things that we talk a lot about in the anti-racism and allyship journey is how to avoid performative allyship or optical allyship, because I think that, you know, most will agree that, you know, to really be an ally requires action. And so, you know, we've sort of, you know, tried to preach that. But I think, Missy, to really drill down on your question, I think it requires humility, it requires listening, and it requires ability to step back and say you're sorry if you have moved too far into somebody's space where you're not wanted. And Lori.
I love what you said, Sarah. And to your point, even the way you framed the question, Missy, shows your deep understanding of this topic, that you wouldn't want to go in and intrude. So I just really appreciate, as you said, Sarah, how you framed the question and everything Sarah said. And the one thing I'd add is have that relationship develop, going back to relationships, to one where you can get feedback. So I'll just give one small example. We were creating what we call a listening session for the staff at the business school, where we had people sign up if they wanted to participate, not in a training, but a space where you could share your experiences about what's happening, about anti-racism, and how, you know, how you might want to take action. And I was invited to help kick that off. And I wanted to make sure that how I did that really worked as an ally and not as someone who knows, or someone who was trying to put my own perspective on. So I made sure that I incorporated into our planning some time to just say, if I say this, how does that land for you? What else is missing? What do you need me to say? So I think back to relationships, having trusted relationships that help you see where your allyship's not working, or how to improve it, or to say, oh, that did work, has been important for me to develop myself, because if I only, as you said, Sarah, come from my own perspective, I might get it wrong. But if I have the ability or humility to ask for support in that, together we can craft how allyship looks versus coming at it as, from two separate sides of the equation.
Yeah, and you mentioned, both of you mentioned like humility, approaching this with a sense of like sensitivity to those around you. And I think there is some recognition in this work that when we, like, because we're trying, there's always going to be the potential to fail, to step in it, to maybe accidentally kind of do something that lands kind of differently than you intended. And I think it's that agency and being proactive about taking ownership and responsibility, learning from those instances, recognizing and acknowledging when you've stepped in it, basically, that really helps in that. And I think that's something for Angelia. I think that's where, for your question here about like, even with good intentions, an initiative might not be executed well or end up taking a step back rather than forward. I think the scaling of taking responsibility, whether it's with an individual or as the leader of initiative, I think that spirit stays the same. So that's a theme that I've kind of pulled from what Sarah and Lori were talking about that I think might be helpful here. Okay, we are wrapping up, but I think this might actually be a time. So we're talking about the approach to the DEI report, the evolution. How do we think about shifting and evolving the way we think and act, taking responsibility for some of those actions? And so as folks from here continue to go on into their lives beyond, are there any other of these small actions or things that people can incorporate into their everyday, knowing kind of that spirit of small wins can like result in some like pretty like meaningful change?
I can take a stab first, if that's okay. I love what you said, Will, because it's not that we have to have our organizations change only. We can become a role model of what change looks like. And I often find that asking new questions is one way that I can create change. So sometimes, for example, I might be critical of a behavior, like, oh, that just didn't seem professional to me. And instead of just moving into that and trying to correct the behavior, sometimes I've stopped myself and asked, well, why am I being so critical here? Because sometimes the behavior is just fine. The reaction I'm having might be based on stereotypes or bias. So one thing is to ask new questions. Why are you criticizing? Or how did you make that decision? Did you make that decision because you're comfortable with the way things are and you don't want to try something new? So for example, what if you picked different criteria for offering someone a really great opportunity? Instead of going with the person who has all the experience, maybe the question is, for whom would this opportunity make a big difference? And then commit yourself to helping them grow into it. So one action I think everyone can take is to ask new questions. Why are you criticizing something? Why are you giving an opportunity to someone? And then seeing if you can come up with a way to develop your diversity, equity, inclusion lens to come up with different answers to the new questions that you're asking. Sarah, I don't know if you have other small wins people can take.
Absolutely love that. I love it, love it, love it, because it really is. And by asking those questions, you are doing two things, which are part of our broader GSB leadership model, which should you come here, you will hear a lot about. But by asking questions of yourself and asking questions of others, you're essentially enacting self-awareness and perspective taking, which are two pieces of our leadership model that we teach here and that we hope people will engage with. And so by asking questions, we're doing both of those. The other thing that I'll say on top of that, I think, is is something that we can all do, and we haven't really talked about this, although it's part of allyship. And I saw in the questions that somebody mentioned the word accomplice. What are, how can we become accomplices? And that's really what I mean when I say allyship should be an action too. The other thing that I would sort of, a very small thing you can do, and I'm going to quote my friend Lori here, you can engage in micro sponsorship. Micro sponsorship, it's a great term. That in the literature on mentorship versus sponsorship, there's a difference, and these are different roles. And when we sponsor somebody, we are getting behind them, and we are using our networks, and we're essentially putting our neck out for them. And that can be scary. Sponsorship can be very, very scary because it's a big lift and because your own reputation is on the line. So how do you think about micro sponsorship as something that is before sponsorship, this big sponsorship? So thinking about ways, for example, to elevate people in meetings and in conversations by making sure you amplify something that they've said, which maybe was looked over. That's one example. Another example is one that Lori just gave in her wonderful answer to this question, which was thinking about changing the criteria a little bit. So rather than going for the person who's maybe the most experienced, who's this, for whom will this opportunity have the biggest payoff, as a different criteria to think about it. So thinking about micro sponsorship as a way that you can intervene in situations which may be suboptimal. You can think about ways that micro sponsorship can be an antidote to microaggressions and suboptimal everyday interactions that we may have. And there again, small things that you can do which can have an outsized impact on the lives of the people around you and the culture that you inhabit.
Yeah, and so as we do this work, how do we know we're headed in the right direction? How do we know we're making progress? Are there ways to measure? Do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to think or communicate around those topics?
I'll say a couple of things. One is mischievous, and that is we know we're doing something right if some people are taking notice and maybe complaining a little. I know the mischievous way. I know that when somebody is making a little complaint, we're probably doing something right. One of the recalcitrant folks. But in terms of measuring too, that's part of what we want to do with the DEI report, is that we want to have an annual metric on a number of different characteristics. And so some, for just very quickly, for example, one of the things that we've been collecting data on are guest speakers in classes. And one of the wonderful things about the GSB is that our faculty and our lecturers have an expanded network of unbelievable leaders who come and speak in classes, and maybe they're a protagonist in the case study, but they come in and share their experience on whatever the lesson is. And we've been able to collect data on those individuals, and up until this point, we've only gotten gender data, but we're now experimenting with, and so in the new DEI report, the 2021, at least for one set of those visitors, we tried out how many people would respond if we sent a survey to them and asked about other identities and so on. We had an 80% response rate on that survey. That's a pilot. So we will use that in this year's DEI report and then be able to expand that to all of the visitors to campus. And so by doing this, this is one way we can measure our progress over time. And another way that we can inspire change by showing, oh, gee, look at this particular group or class. You had a less diverse, set of guest speakers than this other class. And so it's a way to both inspire change, but also measure how we're doing. That's just one example.
Thank you so much. We are at the top of the hour. I just want to thank the both of you for sharing time and space with us today. That was incredible. I also want to thank you for all of the work that you've been leading at the GSB. We would not be where we are today without you, and everything you do inspires us to continue with those small wins. So for everybody who's joined us, I hope you go out, think of those little ways that you might be able to ask questions differently, build on the relationships that are around you, and maybe try a pilot or 2 or 3. The measurement might be different, the way you approach it might be different, but in everything, there's an opportunity to learn, grow, and kind of enhance the realm and the world around us. So with that, thank you again for joining us today. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out at the MBA admissions office. We have one more session later this afternoon featuring Assistant Dean of MBA Admissions and Financial Aid, Kristen Moss. And then closing out this week with one more Faculty Insights with Huggy Rao, where we'll have a very special guest. So hopefully we'll see you there. And until then, stay safe. And I hope our paths cross again soon. Goodbye.